about picky. Sorry, we're going to be talking about picky eating, and let's see, let me just make sure we're going well. Okay, so I'm Breta. I have a master's in clinical nutrition from KU Med. Pretty much what makes me different than a lot of other dietitians is that I only do peds, and I've only ever done peds. So most dietitians are kind of like trained in adults and they end up doing peds, but my entire training has been in pediatrics and specifically kids with neurodevelopmental disabilities or differences. So I was a LEN trainee in 2018, and that was one of the best experiences I could have ever had. I got to learn so much from family advocates and self-advocates, and I did all of my clinical training at Children's Mercy with their feeding team, and I did training as well with the KU Med feeding team, and then most recently I was working for Children's Hospital of Colorado, and I worked with their developmental pediatrics department with a lot of kids with autism on weight management and also growth. And so picky eating is just kind of falls under that. And then of course, some what I would call integrative and functional medicine. So where parents are really interested in like kind of the root cause and healing the body from the inside. So that is what I'm doing now. I actually live in Phoenix, and I do private practice full time, and I do some contract work for some different groups. So there's a lot of different ways that I can see clients. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And I would love to just learn a little bit more about you guys. This will be confidential. It'll just be in the chat. But if you want to introduce yourself, that'd be really helpful. Are you a parent, a caregiver, a case manager? Kind of what are you hoping to get out of today's a session, what's interesting to you, and then I can try and spend a little bit more time on that if there's anything in particular that you guys are hoping for. But I do know it's a very large topic, and maybe you're not sure what you're hoping to get out of it, and I think that's fine. So this has pretty much been designed to be like a crash course of picky eating, and I'm hoping that you're going to walk away with some really applicable strategies to help you help your child or other children with picky eating. Awesome. We got some parents here. Love it. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about the kind of baseline problems with picky eating, what you should be looking for if you're going to work with specialists, picky eating severity, because I know that can be kind of confusing sometimes, the root causes of picky eating, different interventions that we can use to help your child with picky eating, and then some tips that maybe aren't specific to just extreme picky eating, but are definitely helpful. So, all right, it looks like everyone here is a parent. So I love that. So you guys are going to walk away with some really great tips. Yes, you should get the slides and I believe the entire webinar afterwards. So excellent. All right. So my biggest thing is that, feeding shouldn't be a traumatic experience, whether you're starting, to expand your child's diet or you're just living in the day-to-day of that picky eating. It shouldn't always be this huge traumatic struggle every single meal and every single snack. And when you're trying to introduce new foods, we don't want it to be adding extra stress. So we really want to play to your child's strength and make sure that we're lifting them up and it's not this incredibly stressful process for kids or parents. So why is picky eating a problem in the first place? Well, and I know that most people are like, yes, I want my kid to eat more food, but just so we have some good foundation knowledge here, but nutrition is the foundation of health. And so if we're looking long-term, we really want to make sure that we have all those puzzle pieces kind of put together at the beginning. Variety is needed for gut health, and gut health, is like really core to all health. It really plays a huge role in mental health. So even if you're not ready to totally dive into like what's going on in your child's gut, just getting them more variety will help with that. Increased variety will make your day-to-day easier. Eating out, traveling, socializing, all of those different things. Having a slightly expanded palate can help with that. But then I also think that it's important for us to acknowledge that picky eating doesn't have to be like the only thing or your main priority every day, even right now in the season that you're in. So picky eating might be something that you're experiencing, but based on your capacity and what is most important to your family, it might not be the biggest problem at the time that you want to be addressing. So just know that too, that if you don't have the capacity to focus on picky eating right now, that's also okay. All right, so do it yourself or work with a specialist. Well, I'm going to kind of outline this for you. I do think that working with a specialist is great if you have access to that, but not just a singular specialist, putting together a really great feeding team. I do know that with autism, you already have a lot of people on your team. So we're going to try and look at some ways that we could streamline that, because the last thing you need is to be going to more and more therapy sessions. But the helpful thing about working with a specialist is that you get a customized plan based on your child's specific needs. So that is really helpful, because like today, there's going to be a lot of information and that might feel a bit overwhelming. But if you work with someone, you know, in a session with me, I basically say like, here's our one small goal for the week or the month, and that's what you're going to focus on. And so you have like really clear direction. You can also come back and say, hey, that did not work for us at all. And we'll put together a plan on, okay, how can we tweak it? What do we need to troubleshoot? What strengths do we need to play to differently? What supports can we build? So that is really helpful for having like a team around you. And then if there's medical concerns related to a limited diet, like we're not growing very well, or you know, you maybe need to have like a G tube, or we're not getting enough micronutrients or something like that, like iron deficiency is a really big one. You really do want to be working with a team just to make sure that everything is covered. But you can also start doing stuff yourself, especially if you haven't yet tried anything for picky eating. I would definitely just get started. There's no reason for you to not start. There's also other issues with having access to a team. It's not available in all spaces. I know a lot of the feeding teams in Kansas City are booked out for quite a while. And then also, you know, some families have different capacities than others. So if you're, if you have like really high confidence that you're going to be able to like take the strategies that we go over today and implement those into your life, and, you know, you're really confident in that, definitely go ahead and get started yourself for sure. Yes. Access to a feeding specialist is incredibly challenging. So I'm going to try and go through some workarounds for that. The difference between picky eating or food aversion, I think it kind of depends on if it's like an aversion to a specific food, or if there's like all food. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So for your feeding team, some people that we want to look at, an occupational therapist, speech language pathologist, psychologist, dietitian, an ABA therapist, or a registered behavioral tech. So these are, you don't need to have every single one of these people on your team, but you can look at these and say, okay, who's already on my team? Who am I already working with? And who am I going to be working with? And then we can ask them if they will be able to help you with feeding, because they definitely can. I do think that it's great to have support from a dietitian. So as an example, most of my clients I see once a month, but you know, they're seeing their OT or their ABA therapist daily or weekly. So we can kind of coordinate a plan together, and you know, we can figure out a way that we can meet their nutrition needs, and then they can help with all the behavioral strategies on the execution of that. So just because you don't have necessarily like a feeding specialist near you, look at who else is on your team and how we could leverage their skills to kind of help us with feeding. Okay. So we're going to go over a little bit of the details of picky eating, some of the basics. Food neophobia is basically the fear of not wanting to try anything new. And then we have sensory issues, issues with control, appetite issues, and then anxiety. So if you were to look up like types of picky eating, you would come across these. We have preferential eaters, sensory dependent, general perfectionists, and behavioral responders. Now, this isn't the most important thing if you don't need to diagnose what kind of picky eating your child has, but sometimes having a label can be really helpful for you to conceptualize things. So that's why I put them here, and we'll go into them in a little bit more depth. So preferential eaters might have difficulty with new foods. They don't want you to add new foods to their preferred foods. That's just not going to fly. General perfectionists, not anything really specific. You might be having a trouble kind of figuring out like what can I offer you that you want? And like, what do you like? And how can I present that to you? But things like, I don't want that my foods to touch. I only want a certain brand of stuff. So those are some things to look for. And then sensory dependent, food just has to meet the sensory needs. And behavioral responders, they're preferential eaters, and they can also be sensory dependent. And so there's not necessarily like your child probably doesn't fall into exactly one category. There can be a lot of overlap happening here. And like I said, it's not the most important to diagnose like which type of picky eating do we have. I do want to talk about ARFID for just a second. So ARFID is actually considered an eating disorder. It's avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And we just want to make sure that we're kind of aware of this, because there's definitely a very fine line between a picky eater with autism, and a child that has ARFID, whether they also have autism or not. And so when you have ARFID, you really do need like a higher level of specialized care. And so if I ever have like a client that I suspect has ARFID, then I'm going to send them to an eating disorder specialist to have like a full diagnosis done, because they're going to be able to help best with a full eating disorder team. So ARFID is rooted in anxiety. A lot of times kids won't get diagnosed until they have a lower weight, but it is different than something like anorexia. There's really no stress or anxiety around body image, but it's specifically anxiety about eating food, being presented with new foods, swallowing foods, and different things like that. So we're going to talk about some anxiety-based picky eating, which is not quite as extreme as ARFID, but if you suspect your child does have ARFID, it's definitely worth discussing that with your primary care doctor and seeing if you can get evaluated by eating disorder specialists for sure. Okay, so the root causes of picky eating, we have control seeking, sensory needs, poor appetite, and non-ARFID anxiety-based picky eating would be like our root causes. So whenever we're looking at treating the root cause or trying to come up with a way to get our child to try new foods, we want to make sure that we're looking at, well, what's the root cause of this and how can we design strategies that meet that need? And again, this isn't one or the other. Your child can fall into all four of these categories at the same time. So if a child is control seeking, and you might want to take, if you have like a pen and paper, you can take some notes here to just kind of get some perspective on what maybe you're experiencing at home with your kiddo. So they might not eat new foods when you offer it, but if you leave it out and you're doing something else, they might come and like sneak some off the table. That's definitely some control behaviors, or that could also kind of fall into the anxiety, like we just don't want to be performative about our eating, and that can fall into that category as well. But they want to choose their own foods. They want to control where people sit. They throw a fit when things seem out of their control. And you can look at this not just with food, but like, are they seeking control in other places in their life? Or does their life maybe could you see that it might feel really out of control for them? Because then what they might be doing is using their experiences with food to try and have like control over one thing, if everything else kind of feels chaotic. So when we're looking at strategies for control seeking kiddos, we want to make sure that we can give them as much autonomy as possible and as much choice as possible, but we're not going to give up our parental authority. So we have to find that fine line between holding our authority, but then letting them make choices and discovering what's right for them. Okay. Sensory needs is a huge one, especially for kids with autism. And I always like to just go through and ask all of these different questions through all of the senses. And so if you have a pen and paper, you might just want to answer these right now to kind of get a feel for where your kiddo's at. We don't want to just know how their sensory needs impact their food choices, but we want to get a good picture of all of their sensory needs. So that could be, with what does their environment need to be like for them to be happy? And it doesn't always have to be, that they're sensory sensitive to something. We also want to know where they're sensory seeking. So some kids might love messy hands, but hate strong smells, right? So we want to know all of those things so we can tailor our eating environment to meet those those sensory needs. And then also what new foods we're offering, we want to meet those sensory needs. So when we're building our eating environment, if we don't like bright lights, then we want to dim the lights so that way we're not having such sensory overload all at one time. So if we can limit any sensory sensitivities and give positive feedback for any sensory seeking kind of behaviors that we need during our feeding times, then we're going to be a lot more resilient when we're trying some new foods that maybe don't meet our sensory preferences. Right. And then we have anxiety-based picky eating. So I would just kind of look at this as your child overall. Do they experience anxiety? How are they doing in new situations? Some other things you might be looking at is, do they get kind of constant tummy aches that you don't think are really tummy aches? And you're like, oh, I think they're just maybe stressed. And then are you able to convince your child to interact with food after a lot of coaxing, or are they still not interested in it? This could be, are they better at eating once they see you eating a food? So those kinds of things can kind of give you insight to where their anxiety is at. And then some kids have poor appetite as well. And this can be a result of what we call interoception. So that's our ability to kind of experience our body. So that could be experiencing hunger, experiencing fullness, feeling pain, all of those different kinds of things would fall under interoception. And some kids have really weak interoception and they're not able to tell when they're hungry or when they're full. It can be with bathroom habits as well. Maybe they're not good about knowing when they need to poop or when they need to go potty. So those different things can be cues that maybe we have weak interoception. Or they could have really strong interoception and it's as soon as they eat, then maybe they're like, oh my gosh, I just feel full because of something, I am feeling something inside of me. And to me, that says, oh, stop doing that. It's uncomfortable. The sensation is amplified. So all of those things can lead to poor appetite. A lot of autistic kids are also on medications that can lead to poor appetite, especially if they have a dual diagnosis of ADHD. So we want to be cognizant of that as well, kind of looking at, okay, where and how can we promote appetite as best as possible? So here are some questions to ask yourself if you feel like your child might have poor appetite or you're just not 100% sure. But if you have to constantly remind them to eat, if they only eat well when they're offered their favorite foods that they just love, then that could be an indication that they have poor appetite because only the foods that are really exciting are they willing to kind of push past. And then if it's difficult to get them to focus and sit for a meal, could be poor appetite. And I would also ask yourself if they're ever communicating to you that they want food. And when I say communication, they don't need to be coming up to you and asking for food, but that can be a lot of different cues, even if they're nonverbal. So that could be going to the fridge, that could be trying to pull stuff out of the pantry, or some even just more behavioral cues, like are they getting angry or hangry more or are they having some more meltdowns or tantrums during the day? So those are some different things to look at as well. Oh, sorry, I skipped all the way to the end. My apologies here. Perfect. Okay. So before we address picky eating, we want to make sure that we have a really solid foundation. And these are going to be behaviors that aren't just great for picky eaters, but really things that are great for all kids. So if you have one picky eater, but not all your kids are picky eaters, it's okay to make these changes for everyone in the house. It's just going to set them up for success. And it's kind of what we would consider the gold standard for feeding kiddos. So first, we want to make sure that we have a really excellent routine. So for kids, this looks like eating about every 2 to 3 hours. So what that looks like is breakfast, snack, lunch, snack, dinner, snack. There's 2 dinners there, but dinner and then a bedtime snack. But you might not need to have every single one of these based on your personal schedules. So maybe, they wake up at 8 o'clock and you're eating lunch at noon. That's totally fine. You don't need to try and fit a snack in there between those. really what's more important is that we're avoiding constant grazing throughout the day. So, maybe they wake up and they have, a bottle of milk, and then an hour later, they have a really small breakfast. And an hour after that, we do like a little snack. And then an hour after that, we have lunch. That's really what we want to avoid. So we should err on the side of having fewer eating occasions, but having 2 to 3 hours in between meals can actually really help us eliminate picky eating, because we're trying to get kids more in tune with their hunger and fullness cues. So with that being said, if we go over and we look at our next foundation, we want to practice division of responsibilities. So parents are in charge of what, when, and where, and kids are in charge of how much and if they eat at all. And I know that this is a really, really challenging concept to grasp, but parents, your responsibility is not to get your child to eat. Your responsibility is to offer your child food. So when you're offering them, food, they can say, "Ooh, I want this," or "I don't want this," and that's great. But it's also important to make them aware of, hey, if you don't eat this now, you have to wait 2 to 3 hours until we're going to eat next. And so for some kids, that will help kind of prime them to know, like, when I'm offered food, I should eat the foods that I want to eat until I'm full, because it's going to be a little bit until I'm going to get food again. I will say, though, with autistic kids, this can be not always the case. So some kids just won't eat, and they just won't eat all day. If your kid has gone, 2 days without really eating, you just offer them a preferred food and figure out a new strategy for that. But we can still maintain some aspects of division of responsibilities. So we want to offer food with a new food or some other non-preferred food. So that way they always kind of have something that they can eat, but it's not always tailored to them. So, and how you can maintain your parental authority here is that you just pick the days. So like if we're eating, and I know that this gets really hard when it comes down to, like, my child only eats one thing, and so that is all that we have to offer. But when we do have a little bit more wiggle room, you can just pick the days of the week. So they'll eat chicken nuggets. Great. We're going to have chicken nuggets on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And then, on Tuesday, Thursday, and the weekends, we're going to have, these different items. Like maybe we're going to have pizza, which is a food that I know they'll eat sometimes, but maybe they won't eat all the time. But that's kind of how you can work it in. So for some kids, we do need to like modify this a bit, but we want to make sure that it's something that we have given a really fair shot before we start modifying it. Because if we can, we really want to have this as our foundation. I also like to let kids eat for as much as they want. So especially if you're offering them a preferred food, I just set time limits. So for snacks, it's like, great, we have 15 minutes to focus on our snack. And if, you're done or you want more in that 15 minutes, that's great. Have more during that 15 minutes, because we want kids to feel full and satisfied, especially if they're going to go, 2 to 3 hours without eating again. And it might just take a little bit of time to transition onto a schedule like that. And then same thing for meals, but we would want to condense the time to 30 minutes. When kids start spending 45 minutes to an hour at the table, it's just really counterproductive for getting them to try new foods. So shorter times are definitely better, especially if we have trouble focusing. Is really common with ADHD and autism. And then when we're offering foods, this is huge. This will help prevent a lot of unnecessary meltdowns throughout the day. It helps prevent kids from just constantly asking for snacks throughout the day if they are kind of in tune with their hunger and fullness. But what we want to make sure that we're doing is, for snacks, we want to make sure we're offering a protein with a carb or a carb with a fat. So our proteins and our fats are going to help fill us up a little bit more. And this doesn't have to be anything that's like out of this world, something new to them. Like chicken nuggets are a protein, and they can totally be offered, 1 or 2 chicken nuggets at a snack time with crackers. That would be like a good example of a snack that would fall under this category. So for meals, I know that this looks really overwhelming, and I actually don't normally recommend that people do like, a grain, a protein, and then some fruits and vegetables. Mostly what I want people to do for their meals is to make sure that there is a protein, a carb, and a fat. So our carbs are going to be the grains, fruits, and vegetables. And then proteins can be anything from animal proteins like meats, or they could be beans or peanut butter or different things like that that we can kind of work around. And then we always want to have a little bit of fat, but often fat kind of just is naturally incorporated into the meal. So if you're like having meats, normally that has fat in it. If you're cooking anything, normally you've added a fat to it. So there's a lot of different things like that, but adding the protein and the fat will help keep our blood sugar stable. It will help prevent meltdowns during the day, and it will help keep kids full longer too. All right, so now what we've been waiting for, the intervention. What am I supposed to do? I know they're a picky eater. What am I supposed to do about it? So here's some of the interventions that we would look at. So we have something called food chaining, sensory progressions, play, and then a couple different behavioral strategies that we're going to go over. These interventions are best used if we're kind of putting them all together. So normally you wouldn't just say like, okay, we're only going to do food chaining. Sometimes, especially for kids that have sensory like sensitivities, I think combining food chaining with sensory progressions is really, really beneficial. So we're going to dive into each of these. So food chaining is basically just trying to take your child from a preferred food to a non-preferred food. And this can look a lot of different ways, but I think the easiest example is yogurt. If you like say, and this might not apply to everyone's child, it's just an example, but we can move from yogurt to just a flavored yogurt that has a color in it, from that to a yogurt that might have chunks, or if you dice like fresh fruit really thin and add it to the yogurt, to a yogurt that has larger fruit chunks. Then maybe we do yogurt or like fruit that has just been like covered in yogurt, and then fruit that we can dip into our yogurt and eat the fruit. So it's just kind of an example. It's not a quick process by any means. We definitely want to make sure that we're accepting one thing really well before moving to the next. Sometimes we need slower transitions. So like with the colored yogurt, maybe it's adding a spoonful of the colored yogurt into the vanilla yogurt every day until we're accepting that, and constantly going more until we can just transition to the colored yogurt. And then maybe we can add a very small, almost like a rice-sized piece of strawberry into the yogurt, and that's okay, and working through that and constantly adding more. So sometimes it is a very slow process, but that's what food chaining is. And you can look at that in a lot of different ways. It can even, I think going from chips to different things is really helpful. There's a lot of things now that they make, like fruits, vegetables, even meats, that they come in like a chip form that can be easy to transition to if we're working on getting more nutrition into our diet. So some things like that with food chaining. And then sensory progressions is normally where I start with kids. So that can even be offering a part of a food chain. So if you're offering even like a new different kind of chip, if your child struggles with just anything new, this can be really helpful. But remember, we want to remove all our sensory triggers from our environment, and we want to add in any sensory seeking sensations before doing any of this. We also want to set really clear expectations. So our sensory progression is essentially moving through, I need you to touch it, I need you to smell it, I need you to kiss it, I need you to taste it, let's put it in our mouth. Oh, can you chew it? You can spit it out if you want to. A lot of times once kids get to chewing it though, it's pretty easy for them to just swallow it. But that's kind of our entire sensory progression. And so we want to make sure that we're setting really clear expectations when we're doing this. Like, I don't need you to eat this. I just need you to touch it. And like, that's our rule for today at the table. Can we just touch it? And then, once we get comfortable with touching it and playing with it, okay, great. Let's move to let's smell it. We have one caveat here. If your child is sensory sensitive to any of these sensations, we want to skip it. So if they don't like messy hands or touching things, then that's totally fine. We can do hey, let's touch it with a fork. Or they make these really cute little tiny plastic animal skewer forks that could be really helpful for doing that. It's easy for kids to pick up and experience in a different way. Or if they really struggle and they're sensitive to smells, then great, we're not going to smell it. We're going to skip that. Even if we're going to do taste, maybe we hold our nose while we do it. So keep that in mind, that if any of these sensations are triggers for your child, we kind of want to just skip over those. Okay. And then we have play. So remembering that all food experiences are good experiences. So however we can get kids to interact with a new food, and using play, we want to take away any expectation of eating. So I like to do play with food away from the table. So having like a different spot where we're engaging in play with food. That way there's no pressure like, oh, I'm going to have to eat this, but really our goal here is getting that sensory experience, interacting with the food in different ways, and just kind of having some experiences with food that are really positive and aren't always like, oh, I have to eat this, oh, I hate it, that like I don't like the way this feels, like the sensation is assaulting to me. So we want to take all of that stress away. So different things you can do. I really like sensory bins with fruits or with any kind of food. So you can see in this bottom corner here, there's like a little seashell sensory bin, but there's chickpeas, broken noodles, and I think little like pasta stars in there. So some different things like that you can do. And if your child doesn't like noodles, start with dry noodles. Can we stick our hands in it? We can line up the noodles. Can we count the noodles? Can we make them into shapes and letters? And you can do that with a lot of different foods, but those are just some ways that you can work on like developmental skills as well as their sensory experiences and their feeding all at one time. So a couple other things, if you can do any building with different foods, that's really helpful, or like painting with fruits and vegetables where you like cut them in half and you use them as stamps. So there's some different options. Again, we want to take away all expectations of eating. If kids struggle with their hands in a sensory experience, grab them some cooking tools and have them interact in that way. That is still a positive experience. And we're working on some life skills there too. So practicing with utensils can also be a huge piece of our like feeding therapy and sensory experience as well. Okay, we're going to dive into some behavior strategies here. So we have choice, hunger, and fullness awareness. We have routines and transitions, and then some strength-based supports. So starting with choice, I know there's a lot here. I just want to make sure you guys had all the information if you come back to these slides after the fact, but some different ways you can do choice with your child is you offering 2 different foods, and you can say, which one do you want to eat? Do you want, and maybe this isn't right for your picky eater, but just, 2 foods that they like. You could say, do you want tacos or do you want lasagna for dinner tonight? And they can pick out of those. Or you could say, hey, for snack, I'm going to pick your protein. So I'm going to pick the chicken nuggets, but you can pick, if you want, what kind of cracker you want, or you can pick some bread, crackers, or pasta to go with it. So those are different ways that you can do choice. And this is the same as maintaining our parental authority without, while still giving our child autonomy. So those are some options for that. You can have them pick out different things from the store, help with choosing ingredients that you're going to cook with, get them started with cooking. A lot of kids, I find, that are picky eaters, they do like to help with cooking or plating, and they like to plate other people's food. It's just kind of when it comes to their stuff that we're a little bit more hesitant, but plating other people's food and getting involved in cooking is still a really great food experience. Baking can also be really helpful there. Some other things that you can do as far as choice goes, especially if you have multiple kids, is giving everyone one day of the week that they get to kind of like pick dinner or snack or whatever works for your family and like is easy. This shouldn't be just like adding an excessive amount of work to you as the parent, but we can come up with some ways to do that. So maybe it's like on Mondays, one kid gets to pick, and then on Thursdays, another kid gets to pick, and we pick out the week ahead of time. And then what we want to do is come back and say, remember, you chose that you wanted to eat this today. And then when they're kind of upset that like the next time they didn't get to choose, we say, remember when you got to choose and everyone ate, what you wanted to eat. And now your other child gets to choose. And so we're all going to eat what they wanted to eat. So walking kids through stuff verbally can also be really helpful, and kind of creating a structure and a routine around how we're doing things is really helpful. Even if your child is nonverbal, it can be really helpful in just kind of outlining and giving some concreteness to some of these principles for them. Serving family style is also excellent. So having foods all out on the table and then letting kids choose what they want to go on their plate. If you know that, hey, like nothing we're eating tonight, are they're going to eat, I just like to use chicken nuggets are just such an easy example, but what you can do is if they are like pretty much only eating chicken nuggets or a similar food like that, then they can have, and you're making them, their own meal most nights, take that preferred meal and set it right next to their plate. And then depending on their skill level and what the food is, having them either serve themselves from their own little pot, or I like to set out like a whole plate of chicken nuggets and then having them pick how many chicken nuggets they want to go on their plate. That's really easy for most kids to do, is that grab and set down on their plate. If it's like what you would consider like a little bit messier and you're like, oh, the mess from having them like serve themselves a spoonful of mac and cheese is just going to be a lot. Then what you can do is say like, oh, I'm going to help you, but you can tell me when to stop. And so doing stuff that way can kind of give them choice and autonomy on what's on their plate and how much is on their plate. So those are some different options there. Working on hunger and fullness. This kind of goes back to routine like we were talking about. We also want to be really mindful of when you're noticing these kind of cues, whether or not, especially if your child's nonverbal, so these cues right here, that you're like, gosh, I know that they're hungry, like, and if I could get them to eat something, I know that like they're tired, their crankiness, like it would all be a lot better. So it can be really helpful to verbalize that and kind of work them through it and say, oh, tell me how you're feeling right now. And, if they are able to describe that, or even having them point to their body, like, oh, where do you feel like, or like, where do you feel bad right now? Or pointing to their tummy and say like, oh, can you feel anything right here? And then as they're able to acknowledge different things that they're feeling, saying like, yeah, that feeling, that means we're hungry and we need to eat. And so sometimes we just need to kind of create more concrete awareness around some of our hunger and fullness cues. And I have a lot of picky eaters that are underweight, and I have a lot of picky eaters that might have a little bit higher weight too. And maybe we're not experiencing fullness very much. And so there's kind of a whole different host of strategies for that as well. Awesome. And we also want to make sure that we're limiting all intake of calories between meals and snacks. And so this is important, especially if your child's struggling with hunger and even fullness as well. So we kind of have two camps for this. We see a lot of kids who end up being underweight from kind of grazing and snacking on things all day. And we also see kids end up with a higher weight because of this. And there's really no rhyme or reason. It just depends on your genetics and what's going on in your body. But even different drinks that have calories, like soda, juice, sweetened flavored water, and things like that, when those little tiny amounts of calories come into your body all day, it's telling their brain like, hey, I'm not that hungry. Like I've been getting stuff all day. So we're not really hungry. We don't really need to eat. We're just going to keep nibbling and grazing all day. And then a lot of times that ends up with kids having a lot fewer calories than they need for growth. So when we take those out, that helps us come in tune with our hunger and fullness cues a little bit better. And then if you feel like poor appetite is just like debilitating and you've tried all of this, it's definitely worth discussing an appetite stimulant with your physician. So that is an option. That can also be helpful if your child is on medications that might be an appetite suppressant. So there's some different things like that. If your child's on an appetite suppressant, we can do behavioral strategies, all day long. And we want to make sure that we still have that as a foundation, but sometimes kids just need an appetite stimulant to kind of get them going. And one of the benefits of having an appetite stimulant is that it doesn't have to be forever. It can honestly just be like a really great way to kind of jumpstart that appetite. And once kids realize like, oh, I can eat a lot more, I know what hunger feels like, then when you go off of it, they can maintain that same routine of eating more. So Not all of this is as cut and dry. We can say, oh, just do these strategies and it'll be fine. But your child is unique, and there's definitely different things that are going to work for them and not work for them. So we can use a lot of strategies that they might be using in other aspects of their life, and we can tailor those to their nutrition plan. So if you're working with like an ABA therapist, an occupational therapist, or anyone who's working on behaviors with your child, and they've maybe implemented some things like this already, or you've kind of been through like the ringer and you're like, yes, we do everything else really well except for food, then let's look at those tools that you've used. What have been helpful, what haven't been helpful, and how can we make them work for your nutrition plan? So if visual schedules are really helpful, then I think having, a visual schedule, making sure we're outlining meal times is really helpful. It could also be on our visual schedule where maybe we put in the foods that we're going to have and we make those visual as well. So there can be days where, maybe we're going to have preferred foods, and there can be days where we have non-preferred foods, and it's a lot easier to eat the non-preferred foods when we see that, hey, they're on my visual schedule and I know what's coming. So even preparations like that can be really helpful. Transitioning to a routine for some kids can be really challenging, having to wait for food. If they're used to just kind of grabbing chips or cereal and kind of snacking whenever they want to, that transition is really hard to get them onto a routine. So I think that timers can be really helpful, or we can go back to that visual schedule and having them develop their own visual schedule. So then when they're saying, I want a snack right now, and you know that it's not necessarily snack time, you can say, oh, remember you wanted to have snack after we play with, this. And so you can build in transitions that way in creating a different activity to do before we have snack, especially if your child's not quite ready to tell time, or time as a concept is a little bit challenging. That's a really great method. But back to timers. Timers can be triggering for some kids. So there's a couple different things that we can do, but with a timer, you can start small and just working on the idea of waiting for something. So I want a snack right now. Great. We just need to wait 30 seconds and then I will make you a snack. And so you can set like a timer for 30 seconds. If your child doesn't need a timer and they're okay with you just saying 30 seconds, that's also fine. But I mean, ideally, it would be something longer, like we just need to wait 15 minutes or we need to wait 30 minutes. It really just depends on where your child's at, and how well they're able to transition to those longer waiting times. You can slowly reduce the amount of eating occasions during the day. So maybe you're having like 6 snacks a day right now. And then, you can move to next week, we're only going to have 5 snacks a day. And then we can slowly pull out one other snack and then another snack until we kind of get down to that ideal feeding routine of food every 2 to 3 hours. And then we can also do redirect. So some kids are constantly wanting to snack and graze on their preferred foods because it's comforting to them, it is soothing for them, and we want to make sure that we have other strategies to cope with than just food. And food can be a lot of things, and it's not just nutrition, but if it's kind of keeping us in that rut of like, we're only eating the same foods every day and we're using it to cope and soothe ourselves, what else can we do? What other strategies have you noticed are soothing for them? And so we don't want to say, no, you can't have a snack, we're not going to use food to cope. Instead, we can try, why don't we say, hey, how about we color for a little bit? And then if you're still hungry, we'll have a snack. And so you're not denying them the food, but we've created another space and another opportunity for them to do some self-soothing activities. And you can also build some of these things into your day if you notice that, we're getting really anxious, or maybe there's the afternoons we work great in the morning, the afternoon gets a little bit wild, and that's where things kind of start to break down. Then maybe we build in some quiet time as like a transition between our morning and our afternoon. And that quiet time can involve whatever is soothing to them, a really nice sensory experience. Maybe we need some time where we get under the covers or under our weighted blanket, or we, read a book, or we listen to loud noises if that's something that's sensory, like soothing for kids. So it just really depends on your child and what you can build in for them. And then we want to make sure that we have some strengths-based supports. So depending on what your child's diagnosis is and how they've been evaluated, you might have some extra details about how they like their information and how they like to experience the world. And we want to incorporate that into their feeding routine. So as these are just like a couple examples, but if your child is hyperlexic, having the words with the foods, if you're making a visual schedule, is really important. Or having them name the foods at dinner, even if they're not going to eat it, especially if you're showing it in different forms. So maybe your child will only eat French fries, but if we can name, okay, a French fry is potato, and then when you serve mashed potatoes, maybe they're not going to eat it, but can we get them to say potato? And that way we can start building those links and those connections across our foods. If they are very visual, the one thing I don't like about traditional visual schedules is that normally they're like clip art or cartoons. And I definitely think that having real life photos are more helpful. So one of the things I do for my clients is get them real life pictures of food that they can like put on their fridge. There's some different activities you can do where you can have like a plate on your fridge and kids can build their own snacks and meals with stuff that you normally have with those real life pictures using magnets and, building that plate for themselves, even if we're not totally ready to eat the different things. Or dinner, hey, this is what's for dinner, go build your plate, and it's not a plate they actually have to eat off of. That can be really helpful. So I do think real life photos are most helpful if the child is visual, because the picture that they're seeing, we want to match the picture in their brain of the experience. And in autism, that picture is very concrete, and anything that varies from that picture, those are not the same thing. So we want to link those things together as much as possible. Okay, and then other things, like if your child's really good at counting, then maybe instead of having them wait using a timer, maybe we say, oh, I need you to count to 100, and then you can, and then we're going to have a snack. And that can be a great way to start transitioning. It can be something that's fun for them, and also kind of builds in that waiting time. So there's a lot of other strength-based supports that you can develop. These are just a few examples. Honestly, your kids have so many strengths that will help them with picky eating. We just kind of have to uncover what that is. All right, and then tips. These can be tips for picky eaters and also just all kids in general, but these don't necessarily just apply to picky eating. Maybe if there's, if you have a child that's not a picky eater and you're like, gosh, I really just want them to try this food, or I want them to like this food, you can try some of these things as well for that too. Flavor, I think, is a big one that we miss sometimes. So sometimes we're offering new foods, but we're not really thinking about the flavor. So as an example, you're trying to serve broccoli. Well, do they like ranch dressing? We could offer that as a dip. Or if they don't like wet things on their food, we can do the ranch powder and we can sprinkle some ranch powder on there. I have some kids that love salt and vinegar. So on their roasted vegetables, instead of just doing salt, we use like the Buffalo Wild Wings salt and vinegar powder, and then they enjoy them. So there's some different things like that that we can look at. And then, using those preferred flavors with those new foods can be really helpful. Make sure that you're adding salt. Salt is a flavor enhancer. In some kids who maybe don't have a really strong flavor sensation, adding salt will help with that. And honestly, like if your food doesn't taste like anything, why would you want to eat it? I mean, that goes for adults too. We've actually seen that a lot with COVID and people who lost their taste and smell. They're not really interested in any foods because they can't taste them. So making sure that we're kind of, for some kids who are flavor seeking, that we're really bumping up that flavor. I've seen kids do like really the weirdest things with their food, but it doesn't really matter as long as they're getting the variety. So there's no like wrong answer to flavor. And then also keep in mind that if your child's not eating a significant amount of meat, they might have a bit of a zinc deficiency, which can cause poor taste, and it can reduce our ability to taste. You can't really test for zinc deficiency. The tests that we would normally do, they don't really tell us the right information, but a vitamin that has zinc in it can be really helpful for that as well. So yeah. And then making sure that how we're cooking the food is meeting the preferred texture. So if your child likes dry, crunchy things, steaming your vegetables is probably not the best option. So instead, we would want to try roasting them where they can maintain a little bit of that crunch. work on getting them a little bit softer. And this can also kind of fall under that food chaining category. How can we slowly modify things to maybe where they will eat a steamed carrot? But there's just some different things like that you can do. You can even dehydrate your fruits and vegetables to make those more of that preferred sensory experience there. So that's just some stuff that's commonly overlooked. And then feel free to use pre-made items as well. There's a ton of foods out there now that will meet your child's their flavor needs, their texture needs, and their nutrition needs. Something I've come across in the last year is they make these chicken chips, and they are actually like the same texture as like a thin Lay's potato chip, but they're chicken. And one serving is 10 grams of protein, which is more than a lot of kids need at one time. So, you can break them up into smaller pieces. They're crunchy, they have different flavors, so you can pick which meets their needs. So there's a ton of options like that now. One of my go-tos is always like the freeze-dried apples or freeze-dried strawberries. That is typically, they're more consistent in their flavor, and their shape for a lot of kids can be helpful, and they're dry and crunchy. So tips for specific foods, like I said, freeze-dried fruit. Sometimes when we talk about this, people kind of default to a dried fruit. A dried fruit is going to be more chewy, and normally, I'll just say, like, most kids that I work with their sensory experiences prefer more of a crunchy texture. That's not to say I don't have some kids that really don't like crunchy and they like the softer texture or they like chewy things. But if your child does prefer a crunchy option, make sure we're staying away from dried fruit. That often gets like confused with freeze-dried, and we want the freeze-dried or dehydrated would be our like best options. We can also play around with dips that play to like preferences. I think sugar is really overlooked. And if your child kind of likes sweet things, great. Like, how can we make some conventional things a little bit more sweet? So they even make like chocolate hummus or caramel hummus, which have some fat in them. They're not very high in sugar, but they definitely add sweetness to like fruits like strawberries and apples. Same thing with vegetables. You can actually add a little bit of sweetness to a lot of vegetables, like honey on carrots or sweet potatoes and different things like that. So just really play to their strengths. And we talked about this, roasting vegetables or instead of steaming them. There's a brand called Rhythm. They make veggie chips, which are different than like the typical veggie chips you see at the store in the giant bags. The Rhythm ones are actual like dehydrated vegetables. So they have a really delicious cauliflower, really great broccoli. They make fruits. So I would definitely try those if your kid likes dried, crunchy things. Their cauliflower is actually amazing. I'm a big fan and I buy it for myself too, especially for like snacks when we go hiking and stuff. And then grains, we also want to play to our flavor preferences. Do they like sweet? Do they like sour? Do they like salty? What can we add to our grains to make that a reality for them? Especially something like rice. You can add butter and sugar to it if you want to make it a little bit more sweet, and that might be more palatable to your picky eater, depending on what their preferences are. Meats, we talked about the meat chips, maybe even jerky would be a good option. A lot of times meats are hard for kids, especially when they have kind of a heightened sensory palate. The iron and just the kind of like the blood, meat tastes a lot more metallic a lot of times, which cannot taste good. So sometimes we can try other proteins like tofu or beans, which I know is not super common for a lot of people to eat, but it's definitely like growing in popularity. So if we can incorporate more of those things, that's totally fine as a protein. I will also, like, if your child is really not getting any protein, I'll use collagen peptides, and you can mix those into almost anything. You can mix them into soups, you can mix them into water, you can mix them into juice. So anything like that. Just keep in mind, if you do use the little packets of collagen peptides, kids don't need an entire packet. So you should check with someone before you give that, because they can get too much protein, but it's a really great way. It's like dissolvable powder. You can put it in their water, boom, they're getting a little bit of protein throughout the day then too. Okay, that is it. Oh, perfect. I made perfect time. Do you guys have any questions? I think we're going to go ahead and stop sharing, so you can always pop on and you can type your questions in the chat, and or you can,